So, hi. So in the last section, we finish off reflecting on, are antidepressants overprescribed and what could be done what could we do about that? If you do think antidepressants are being overprescribed, then there's lots of things we might do, aren't there? You could try and change society somehow. Why are so many people depressed? Is it down to stress in society? Have we made work too precarious? Are too many people struggling to survive on low incomes? Is it, coming from a slightly different angle, are we overprescribing medication because we're not providing sufficient alternatives to medication? Obviously, as a psychologist, I'm a little bit biased in that respect, and would argue that we should probably provide more psychological treatments, for example. So, moving on, how do antidepressants work? So we talked earlier about the biological theory of antidepressants, that they might work by changing our serotonin system. But the trouble is, what does the serotonin system actually do? And we don't fully understand that yet in terms of neuroscience. Is it possible, for example, that by increasing supply of serotonin we can somehow inhibit our emotions better? So are antidepressants simply allowing people to turn off their emotions, to block themselves from their emotions, which is what a lot of people on antidepressants often say. That's their impression. They feel as if they can block their emotional life. If that's the case, is that healthy? Is that a good thing? Would it be better, therefore, to encourage people to do psychotherapy instead? Quite often when people are depressed, they will be prescribed antidepressants and therapy at the same time. Is that a good thing? If, as we've just discussed, antidepressants may allow people to block their emotions, is that going to affect their ability to engage in therapy? That's one of the common arguments that's often put. If we think that therapy might be useful, what kinds of therapy should people engage in? One of the ways of finding out answers to that is to go and look at the website of this organisation, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. NICE provide guidance to the health service on all kinds of conditions, including mental health conditions, including things like depression. So if you go to the NICE website and you type in depression into this search bar, you will be able to find the depression in adults guidelines. And this tells you lots of information about what medications you probably ought to prescribe, whether you should consider doing psychotherapy, how long you should give psychotherapy, what kinds of psychotherapy. So, for example, in terms of psychotherapy, the NICE guidelines suggest that if you are somebody with mild to moderate depression and you've not benefited from low intensity psychosocial intervention, so before you actually get any therapy, NICE recommend that you will have had online CBT, that you might have taken part in a CBT self-help group, and if that's not worked, then you may get one-to-one therapy. And if you get one-to-one therapy, they suggest that you might get an antidepressant or a high-intensity psychological intervention such as CBT, interpersonal therapy, behavioural activation, which is, you could argue, part of CBT, the CBT type of approach, or behavioural couples therapy if your depression is linked to something to do with your relationship, perhaps. So NICE are quite prescribed in what they think you should have access to. This is stuff that they feel there is evidence for, that there's clinical trials for. So notice that logic that's come from the medical model, that's come from research on medication, has been imported into therapy with this idea that if you're going to be prescribed CBT, it has to be evidence-based, there must be clinical trials. The problem with that, of course, is that not all therapy lends itself to clinical trials. Because to do a clinical trial on a therapeutic approach, you need to be able to standardise it, homogenise it, and apply it to well-defined conditions. And as a therapist, I would suggest that's very rarely the case. People are very individual in the way in which their low mood affects them. They may have all kinds of other stuff going on at the same time, and it's generally not the case that you can apply a simple, rigid approach to any one person. And we could argue, therefore, it's those therapies, such as CBT, which lend themselves to being standardised and homogenised, for which, therefore, it's fairly straightforward to do clinical trials, for which, therefore, there ends up being more evidence, and which, therefore, end up being recommended by NICE. Whether that means they are actually the most effective is another question that one might debate. So, if you get offered one-to-one therapy on the NHS, it's highly likely that it's going to be CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy. So if you get CBT, what are the key principles of CBT? Well, if you know about CBT, you'll know that it was developed by a chap called Aaron Beck. And Beck's key notion was that when people are depressed, their thinking is dominated by negative thoughts. In fact, he called them negative automatic thoughts, NATs. So these are negative thoughts that we have that are fairly automatic. We think these negative thoughts. We often don't realise that we're thinking these negative thoughts because they're automatic in how they occur. So let's just think hypothetically, we had a patient, a client, who I've called John. So John is having negative thoughts. When I do this in class, I would get you to talk about this in pairs. But I just want you to think for a minute, see if you can write down one or two negative thoughts that John might be having. What sort of negative thoughts do you think people with depression may have? So try and write down one or two examples of negative thoughts. What sort of negative things might people think when they're depressed? Okay, so hopefully you've managed to write something down. Here's some examples I came up with. These are, actually, I know as a therapist, the sorts of things that people might say. So they might say, I don't feel I'm good enough. They might say, I don't think I'm achieving what I want to. I don't think I'm achieving enough. They might say that I have difficulties with my relationships. There may be stuff going on at home for the person. They might feel that they can't cope, perhaps, with a loved one at home being ill. They might have financial issues and feel that they're struggling with money. They might have been made unemployed and be struggling to find another job. So there's all these kinds of thoughts out there. It's interesting to think about these in terms of, if you look at these kinds of thoughts, some of these thoughts might be things that people have thought for a long time, like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not achieving what I want to, that might be rooted in aspects of their early history and experience. For example, if you had very critical parents who constantly gave you negative messages about yourself, so you might end up as an adult thinking these quite negative thoughts about yourself. Obviously, some of these things are stuff that's happening currently due to issues in the person's current life, like relational difficulties. or somebody being ill, or not having enough money, or having lost your job. So some of this stuff might be things that people are reacting to right now. And of course, if they have negative thoughts based around their early history, like I'm not good enough, that might interact with these current issues, like I'm having trouble in my relationship, and that's partly because I'm not good enough. So you can see how these negative automatic thoughts actually do come from somewhere. CBT tells us basically that what we need to do is to challenge these thoughts, to ask, are they true? Is there good evidence to support these assertions? What evidence is there? Can we do behavioural experiments? If we think other people have a negative view of us, for example, is there any evidence for that? Can we go out and challenge that? So in cognitive behaviour therapy, typically clients are asked to record and monitor their negative thoughts. They are taught to challenge those thoughts, to question the evidence, and sometimes to try and decouple that inner critic, that inner voice that has those negative thoughts, to just allow that to get on with its dialogue and not pay it too much attention. That's the approach of mindfulness. Now, one critique you might have of all that is it sounds a bit like brainwashing, trying to tell people that you shouldn't think like this, you should think like that. This is how I want you to think. Perhaps to reinforce that over many, many sessions. It says here, definition of brainwashing, any method of controlled systematic indoctrination. Well, that sounds like 20 sessions of CBT to me. I don't know what you think. We were talking about cost in relation to drugs earlier. What about the cost of therapy on the NHS? The main therapy service at the minute is called IAPT, Increasing Access to Psychological Therapy, and it's been estimated that a typical session of high intensity therapy costs around £176, or it did in 2009 anyway. From this cost study, you can estimate that across the entire National Health Service, which currently has about 330,000 patients, the total cost of all that therapy is about £300 million, so a similar cost to what we're spending on antidepressants for therapy. But notice the numbers are significantly less, 330,000 as opposed to 3.6 million people who are being prescribed antidepressants. So let's move on a bit. If we think that depression might be linked to these negative thoughts that people have, where do those negative thoughts come from? Why do people have negative thoughts? So again, I'm just going to give you a minute to see if you can write some thoughts down on your paper. Where do you think people get their negative thoughts from? Why do they have negative thoughts? I won't leave you mulling that one over for too long, because I gave you some clues in the slide earlier when we were looking at examples of negative thoughts. It could be that people's past life experience. If you had highly critical parents, for example, as fortunately many of us have had, and that leaves you then with a very critical sense of yourself, an idea that I'm not good enough, I don't work hard enough, I don't achieve enough. So your past life experience may have led to a certain view of yourself, a self-construct that leads you to being highly critical and therefore having negative thoughts. It could be that it's down to current adverse life experiences, like having been made redundant in the middle of the pandemic. And of course those two things can interact with each other, so that your current adverse life experience might link to those negative thoughts from your early experience. And you end up thinking, I haven't got a job at the minute, that's partly because I'm not good enough and I don't try hard enough, etc., etc. Okay, so we're at another one of our points for reflection. So we've just been talking about CBT. We pointed out that that's one of the most common approaches that you're likely to be prescribed by the National Health Service at the moment. And you would have guessed from my critique that what I'm suggesting is that CBT by itself doesn't seem to be a very deep form of therapy. It's quite shallow. It's saying, look, so what negative thoughts do you have right now? And you need to challenge them and try not to have them and to think more positively. So I want you to think for a few minutes about what forms of therapy might allow for deeper reflections on people's thoughts and behaviour patterns. What sort of therapy might there be that would allow for that other than CBT? Just think about that for a couple of minutes and then we'll come back for the final part.